It's a great pleasure to have with us today Paul Lewis, a great friend of the Muse concert program. In fact, Paul was the last person to play a live concert here at the University of Hong Kong. Hopefully we will resume and hopefully he will come back. So welcome, Paul. Lovely to see you again.
You too. Thank you very much.
How have you been during this crazy time?
Well, I've been okay, thank you. Early on, I got ill in March. I don't know whether it was COVID because, we weren't really up to speed with testing at that time, but otherwise I've been fine. And actually, it's been a great time of discovery, without the deadlines of concerts, of having to get repertoire ready, to be able to just explore a lot of different repertoire has been a great pleasure, and exploring things that I might not have, had I had my concert schedule this year.
So what kinds of things have you been exploring that have sort of led to new insights for you?
Well, I got into a phase of French music. I learned the Ravel G major concerto, which I'd never learnt before. I've been looking at some Debussy and also some old repertoire that I haven't played since the 90s, like Rachmaninoff concertos, which, to be honest, I never thought I'd play again. And then I got them out and thought, oh, this seems like fun, actually. So looking through that and also looking through a lot of Mozart, I found that the optimism in Mozart's music was very important for me at a point, given the amount of despair and uncertainty that we're all faced with at the moment. So I had at least a month and a half of just sort of learning Mozart sonatas and some of the concertos that I hadn't learned before, and I found that very reassuring in a way.
But I can't live without the Mozart concertos. Actually, I find them extremely uplifting. But what is it about Mozart for you that you find optimistic, as you say?
I mean, it's just something that's very forward-looking in the music. Of course, Mozart despairs as much as any other composer, but you don't. I'm trying to think of even a piece like the C minor piano concerto. It's what you just said. You feel uplifted after that. You don't go away with a sense of despair, even if there's a lot of that in the music. There is something that there's a sort of unshakable optimism about his music, I feel, and something, like I said, that we can use more of in these times.
And there's a sense in which I think the music tends to, just kind of play, right? There's a kind of playfulness there that is always trying, in one sense, to be very joyful, even if it's a kind of a minor key work. There's something that's happening with all this figuration that is just, so graceful and just puts a smile on your face in a funny kind of way. I don't know what it is about Mozart that does that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
But what about, because you've been, you're well known for Schubert, very different from sort of the optimistic Mozart. I mean, do you find that Schubert also would speak to you at this time, or is that just a little bit too much to handle in this time of COVID-19?
No, I felt it has spoken very importantly in this time, but in a very different way, of course, to Mozart. Schubert, as we know, when he got his diagnosis of syphilis in 1823, that had a huge impact on his music. I mean, prior to that, there was a sense of longing and nostalgia and melancholy, but that all took a much bleaker and despairing turn. And there's something, I always think of one of the main differences between Beethoven and Schubert is that Beethoven always finds an answer. Beethoven always resolves somehow, and Schubert almost never does. So what is it that is consoling about Schubert's music? I've wondered about that, and maybe it's the way that Schubert is able to put very clearly into music things that we feel that are often quite difficult to put into words. He puts it in a way that's very direct and that we understand. And I think to some extent, when we listen to Schubert's music, even if we do have this sort of sense of despair, we do feel that sense of despair in it, we feel that he's with us. We feel that we're understood. He understands what we're going through, even if there aren't necessarily obvious answers to things. Well, that's part of the human condition, really, isn't it? You know, that's what we are. We don't find answers to everything. But to hear music that understands that and reassures us that it's with us, I think is also very important in this time. That's what I felt.
Is there a particular piece, sonata, or moment in Schubert that really encapsulates this sense of him sort of going through tragic times with us kind of experience?
Gosh, there are many. Yes, I always think of the A minor sonata Deutsch 784, which was written around the time of his diagnosis, early in 1823, which is one of the most distressed pieces of music I know. There's even some rather raw anger in that. It sort of developed from there in a way. If you look at some of his later pieces, like the A major 959, I think of the ending of that piece, that the end of the last movement is utterly heartbreaking. It's as if he can't let go of that theme. That beautiful theme in the rondo theme in the last movement. It's like a dear friend. And at the end, where he just repeats the last bar of the phrase of that theme, it's like he knows that he won't see that friend again, and is desperate not to say goodbye, but knows he has to. But there's something about it that still is okay. You know, we survive. We go on. There's a sense of acceptance about it. I think that in some way encapsulates what Schubert is about. Even when there are no answers, we survive. You know, we go on. We still find a way. And let's say that that's the position we find ourselves in at the moment in many different respects.
Right, absolutely. I mean, that kind of I guess it's a kind of bittersweet lyricism that you get in Schubert, where it's so beautiful, but at the same time so heart-wrenching, because you say, it's like just staying there. You can't take your face away from this beautiful thing, but at the same time you know that you're fading away, but you're the one that's losing that. But that beauty still remains somehow. But there's also something about Schubert where, in a way, it's much more violent than Beethoven. I mean, I was thinking about, say, the slow movements of that A major sonata, where it just goes into this extraordinary kind of, I don't know what kind of hurricane sort of rips through the lyricism. I mean, that's not a kind of bittersweet Schubert. I mean, that is a truly angry, violent Schubert, right?
Yeah, he screams in agony in the middle of that movement in a way that Beethoven never does. I mean, Beethoven can, bellow right from the bowels, but he doesn't scream in anguish like that, like the way Schubert does. Interestingly, when I just think of it now, the times that Schubert does provide a resolution to something, think of Die Schöne Müllerin, which he also wrote in 1823, the year that he realized that he would die young. There's a resolution at the end of that, and it's death. The resolution is less consoling in a way. Schubert's resolution is less consoling than when he doesn't resolve. But yes, Beethoven finds a different way. I mean, Beethoven often, I feel, powers his way to an answer. He just rises above and imposes his will on whatever struggles or questions that there may be.
I mean, you feel when you play, I don't know, maybe late Beethoven, that the music always resolves, or do you feel sometimes really he also has this sense where he's not, he doesn't really know. I mean, he's just trying to end, but then there are really questions that he cannot himself answer.
I feel sometimes in late Beethoven, he just rises above the questions. If it's a resolution in a different sense. You think of the end of Opus 111. It's,
right.
you know, it's nothing is important anymore. You know, whatever questions there may have been, they're just not important. It
just transcends everything at that point. And I always think of that piece as, you know, the first movement is the struggle, and it gets this amazing coda where he, you know, from C minor to C major, the whole thing relaxes, and almost the last movement is almost like a giant cadence or a giant sort of C major resonance to where he's got to, you know, in the first movement, and then sort of ends with this extraordinary kind of, I guess it's a kind of, well, people often think it's a kind of farewell because it has this very nostalgic feel to it. But as you say, it has this kind of transcendence about it. Somehow the issues are no longer issues for Beethoven. You know, it's like he doesn't need to worry about that anymore. In a way, it's not about death. I mean, Schubert is always about death somehow, you know, because of course he's dying of an infectious disease like COVID-19. But Beethoven is not really thinking about death somehow. It's always something way beyond that.
It's exactly what you say at the end of 111. It's as if it sort of passes into a more spiritual realm somehow. The issues are not issues, like you say, and there is a sense of something valedictory about it, but at the same time, there's equally a sense of opening up into something different, which just makes everything else irrelevant somehow. So the struggles of the first movement are very much in the past, and you know that's the answer he finds later on in his life.
One of the pieces that I don't think I can live without is the slow movement of the hammer Clavia, which is in a way kind of the opposite of Schubert, where, you know, Schubert gets to this kind of bittersweet ending, and Beethoven starts with this kind of death-like theme, and then it takes you somewhere that, again, as you say, sort of transports you into another place. I mean, what's your view of that particular movement, and then what's your view of the fugue that comes afterwards? I'm very curious about the way you think about the hammer Clavia.
Well, when I've played it, my view of the fugue is one of enormous stress at that point. You know, I can't think of a more stressful piece of music that I've ever played. It's incredibly difficult, the hammer Clavia. But of course, the slow movement is one of the great adagios of all time in all music. Really, for me, there's that, and there's the slow movement. There's the last movement of Mahler 3, which sort of comes somewhere near it. I can't remember who said it, but there's a quote from someone that the slow movement of the hammer Clavia is a mausoleum of suffering, and it's absolutely spot on. There's so much suffering in that movement, but in the end, of course, it's even there's a kind of, I'm not sure whether to call it a resolution, but there's this very introspectively soothing F sharp major that he finds in the end. But there's a tension in there as well. There's an expectation of something, and the way he slips down a semitone from F sharp to F natural for the introduction of the fugue, and then writes this completely insane and intractable fugue. I mean, it's just impenetrable in a way. It's like the ultimate answer, but in a physical way. It's his physicality in that fugue that really is powering through and casting all questions aside. But really, the extraordinary thing about that piece, for all the difficulties of the fugue, is of course that slow movement, really.
When you get to the end of the fugue, I'm always very curious about this. I mean, it doesn't, I mean, all the big chords are not even on the downbeat. They're kind of written on, I can't remember, some sort of bizarre beat in the bar. I mean, it seems to me that despite all the pyrotechnics there, I mean, that as you say, that sort of, you know, just crashing through everything with this fugue, you know, almost totally in your face. It's not quite a resolution in the normal Beethoven sense that you might get at the end of the Fifth Symphony, where it's like, you know, victory is assured kind of thing, right? There's something much more, I don't know, violent, brittle, you know, questioning about that ending, don't you think?
There's something, I think, for all it's, you know, the fugue is what, 12 minutes. That movement it's a very substantial movement, but there's almost something abrupt about that ending. We don't feel that we're at the end of the journey in the same way that we might do it in a middle period work, for instance, like the Fifth Symphony that you mentioned, or the Waldstein Sonata, or something like that. There's something different about it. There's something more angular about the way he resolves. I mean, even the last couple of lines where he writes, he's mentioned that the chords are not on the downbeats. He writes, I think, for most of that. I think, in fact, the last two lines are actually in 4/4, right? It's still in 3/4 written down. But he totally disregards the meter and writes just over that. And there's something so contrary about it.
Well, as you said, it's insane fugue.
That's very typical of Beethoven all the way through his life.
It's so different from Schubert. I mean, Schubert, in a way, is a kind of desolate landscape, right? When you think of Schubert, I mean, even when he is, I don't know, moving very, very fast, say those last movements in those late sonatas, it's a kind of, I don't know, I can't quite call it a death dance, but there is something relentless about it. But it's in a kind of bucolic scene. It's always something like a landscape or a pastoral, but somehow it's gone horribly wrong, even though they're celebrating. Whereas Beethoven is, it's very seldom a pastoral. It's more interior in a way, and Schubert tends to make the interior sort of outwards into that kind of landscape where all kinds of terrible weather and terrible changes of terrain can happen. Yeah.
What you're saying makes me think immediately of the last movement of the C minor Schubert Sonata, where it is a kind of dance of death, and that there's something very, very much of pursuit about it. This is death pursuing you, and there's no escape from this fate. And yet the middle section that he starts in B major, again, one of his semitonal shifts, that you think of the color, the contrasting color between C minor, the tragedy of C minor, and the openness of B major. In a way, there's something almost sunny about it, but the way Schubert presents it is so full of nostalgia. And to me, when Schubert uses a major key in the context of a minor key in that way, it's the minor that represents the reality,
right?
And the major that represents the nostalgia, the memory, the things you can't have anymore. And that's what makes it so heart-wrenching. And it's a great example of that in the last movement of the C minor.
I was also thinking about humor, because in a way, I remember you playing the Diabelli variations at Hong Kong U, and there were moments when people laughed out loud, because they're very funny moments that Beethoven is having a laugh. I was thinking about Schubert, and whether you ever find Schubert funny at all, or is it really just kind of like not funny?
I find Schubert good-humored, especially in his, let's say, his pre-syphilis days.
Right.
It's still there afterwards. This sense of gemütlich, this good humor. But I never find him funny.
Right.
Beethoven can make you laugh. Haydn can make you laugh. Mozart also sometimes can make you laugh. I sometimes feel Mozart's laughing at us, actually. This is sort of the other way around. But Schubert never. I mean, it's a little more like Brahms in that sense. I don't think Schubert wants to surprise us in a way that makes us laugh. He's not mischievous. He's good-humored. He smiles, and sometimes he smiles genuinely. It's not just a sad smile. But I don't feel that humor is really a big part of Schubert's music at all. At least I haven't found it yet. I'll keep looking.
Maybe there's a moment somewhere. But anyway, it's lovely to talk about all this great music. I want to talk about you a little bit. And I was wondering what the new normal is like for you. You're going back to giving concerts. Has it been difficult? Has it been something that it has brought great joy and relief to you, or has it been a real challenge?
I think this time, this last 6 months, has really clarified things in a way and reinforced what's important. And for me, actually, reinforced what makes live performance unique and what's important about that. Because I've done a couple of live streams. You know, the Wigmore had this series in June of live streams from an empty hall, which I think all of us that took part in that were delighted to take part and terrified to take part. There was something, it's just that the whole strangeness of the situation. But that series to me was as much of a statement as anything else. It was to say, look, here's the empty Wigmore Hall, but we're still here. We're carrying on. I think we've moved on a little bit from then, and I've this month played a few concerts to smaller audiences. What seems to be happening a lot is that you play a slightly shorter recital program without interval and play it twice or even 3 times, you know, to a small group of people, so that you end up sort of playing to more or less what the audience you would have played to. And that, for me, it's really been a reinforcement of what makes it special. You know, you need those people there. You need the energy of an audience. Music is essentially a social thing. You know, it's an experience that we have together. You know, when you play in an empty hall and it's a live stream, it's supposed to be a concert, but it's not a concert at all. You can't recreate that energy of a silence with a couple of hundred people in the hall. You know, everybody listening intently and concentrating. There's no way you can manufacture that. And I don't think any amount of technology will help us there. You know, this is something that I think everything we do now has to point back to, you know, getting people back into halls as safely as possible, and of course at the right time. But that's where music lives, I feel. That's where the experience lives. It's when we all experience it together.
Right. And I guess the live stream would be different from some kind of a recording in a studio. I mean, because obviously you make a lot of recordings and there's no audience. I mean, there'd be a sound engineer, but there's no real audience there. So is it different from that?
Yeah, because when you make a recording, you know, it's a different mentality, really. You're aiming at something different. With a live performance, you're aiming at an experience. You know, sort of conveying something in the moment, and that's what a concert is. It's a snapshot of something that happens there, and it lives in people's memories. A recording lives on a CD or on a hard drive, or you know, or something else. And I think we inevitably, of course, we listen differently to recordings than we do to live concerts. So when you make a recording, you're looking to achieve a certain amount of detail that maybe, you know, you wouldn't necessarily achieve in the concert hall. You know, if you play a few wrong notes in the concert hall, people don't necessarily hear that because they're listening to music. You hear it more easily on recordings. That's why, you know, you make sure there are no wrong notes in recordings. And this is why the idea of live streaming from an empty hall, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, there's a friction between those two things there. Yeah, but for me, getting back into the hall and playing to people, even if it's 10 people, is such a pleasure. You know, it's just a real joy.
So now that you have this contrast between the kind of empty concert hall and live streaming, and then just playing to humans again, live humans, I mean, do you feel that your performances actually are changed by the audience that is there? I mean, you're saying that without the audience, something doesn't happen. There's something that doesn't work for you, right? That means that every time you play, it'll be different, or, you know, you're reacting to audience, I don't know, concentration or whatever. And that you are changing your interpretation all the time, or your level of risk. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And I've long felt that there are things, you know, you can practice and study till you're blue in the face, and you know, sort of airbrush things and make sure you know exactly what you're doing and turn every stone. But there are things that you would never learn, that you can never discover until you're in front of people, until you have that energy and that kind of focus. And I remember there was a point years ago that I realized that. And it was in a performance of, I think it was my first performance of the Tempest Sonata. So I was playing it for the first time. And with those recitative passages at the start, it was about the timing of those, the color, and the silences, more specifically the silences between them. I think, something, I just realized something in the performance, and it wasn't that I kind of knew exactly how to do it, but I thought, this is a lesson. This is where I learn how to do this. And you have to treat each performance, in a sense, like a lesson. You go away from each performance with it fresh in your mind. What worked, what didn't quite, what you discovered, what was a surprise, in both good ways and bad ways. And that's how I think that's how you evolve and how you develop as an artist and as a musician. And it's another reason why, we need live performance.
It's interesting actually, just listening to you talk about this, how in a way the audience makes the silence, because actually the silence of the concert hall is a kind of given kind of thing, but a made silence by people really creates that kind of atmosphere in which music can become live, as it were. Classical music anyway can become live in that kind of very dynamic sense, right? There's the audience silence. It's something that really galvanizes you to play in a way to that silence, or to their concentrated silence. It's a very thick kind of silence.
Yeah, it's the audience are as much participants as the performer or performers. It really is the case, and it's those situations where silence becomes music. And in some cases, in the case of Schubert, quite often, the silence is at least as important as the sound. But we have to give that silence a meaning and a purpose, and it can only have that meaning and purpose with the audience that makes that silence. Yeah, it's true.
It's true. Actually, all the music you play so brilliantly, in fact, requires that silence. I mean, Beethoven, Schubert, Mozart, they all need that for it to really work, as you say. Yeah. But I wanted to also talk a little bit about your future projects, because, you've had this time of, learning and exploring new things. Obviously, most of the Beethoven concerts have been cancelled or postponed for this, celebratory 250th anniversary year. But Schubert is coming up soon. And I'm just wondering, what are you thinking of presenting to the world, in the coming few, I guess you had to plan a few years in advance, what's up your sleeve, as it were?
Well, in the next couple of seasons, there's a mixed bag of repertoire, really. I would quite like to throw in some of the things that I've reworked and discovered. Ravel, G major, Rachmaninoff again. Why not? I haven't played it since I was in my 20s. And for 22-23, so a couple of years down the line, I've been planning a series of Schubert sonatas, so all the completed sonatas plus the Reliquie Deutsche 840, which is a kind of incomplete sonata, like the unfinished symphony in a way. So that's what I've been really looking forward to coming back to. I did a similar series. Well, I did the last 6 years of his piano music about 10 years ago. And then 10 years before that, I did a similar series that I'm planning in a couple of years with the completed sonatas. I'm so looking forward. I can't wait for that. A year of Schubert for me is the ultimate indulgence. When I've done it before, it's like spending a lot of time with one of your closest friends. But of course, you don't always get on. You realize you discover the things, the areas where there are friction as well. But it's for me that's what I look forward to almost more than anything, musically speaking.
And now that you're doing Schubert, as it were, that cycle again, I guess you must have changed your understanding of it and your performance of it, particularly after everything that the world has been through these last few months. Is it a different Schubert that you're sort of getting ready for his year?
I think so. Inevitably, it will be different. It's hard to say exactly how. I suspect it might be bleaker in a way. I I remember it was actually through working at the song cycles that I've played with Mark Padmore. Certain songs in Winterreise and Die Schöne Müllerin, especially though there are songs like Wegweiser and Die böse Farbe in Müllerin, where you have this repeated, the same note repeated all the way through the song. There's something, when I think of pieces like the first impromptu of Deutsch 899, where you get this repeated G, ba, 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 ba. I always thought of that in my early days as an accompaniment. And then I realized it's not an accompaniment at all. It's fate, it's inescapable fate. It's something that's always there that we can't get away from. And that was a point at which I think my Schubert playing changed. So there are things there are kind of events that do make a noticeable difference to the way I play. But I think in general, you live your life, you kind of, what happens in your life inevitably feeds into the way you see this music. And this time of uncertainty and despair, of course, is part of that.
What about the comment you made earlier about Rachmaninoff? Like, you went back to playing Rachmaninoff, and then you thought, you would never revisit these, concertos again. What was the reason for that? Because actually, my view of, particularly the second piano concerto, is that it's one of the most perfect piano concertos out there. But it is interesting that I don't associate you with Rachmaninoff. I'm just curious about, your experience of Rachmaninoff, and then not playing Rachmaninoff, and then thinking to yourself, well, maybe, I should return to this music.
I don't think I've ever had anything against Rachmaninoff. In my teens and 20s, I played a huge amount. I played the second, third, and the Rhapsody. And actually, when I was at school, I played an awful lot of Russian music in general, Prokofiev and Scriabin. And yeah, nobody would think that these days, of course, because then I sort of focused pretty much exclusively for a time in my 20s on Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, Haydn. And that's the direction my repertoire took. And I'd say it really is the core of my repertoire. I think it always will be. But I don't know. I never wanted to close any doors. And I think it's rather just the focus on a completely different area of repertoire that perhaps, meant that I didn't pay attention to other things so much. But I'm more minded at the moment to go back to those things. And of course, thinking of, I mentioned I learned the Ravel concerto for the first time. Well, I'm 48, so it takes longer to hammer the notes into your brain than it does when you're 16. But Rachmaninoff 2 was the first concerto I ever played with an orchestra when I was 16, and you get it out now, having not looked at it for over 20 years. And it's somehow still there. It's inside somewhere, and your fingers sort of know where to go. And there's something wonderful about that. Again, it's like coming back to an old friend. And I thought, I do want to do this again.
I think it'd be wonderful to hear you do that. I'll be there when it happens. Paul Lewis, Rachmaninoff too. I'll turn up for that one, and the Ravel. I'd love to hear you do the Ravel, because in a way, it's so different in the sense that it kind of, I don't know how to describe Ravel, but it's kind of it's difficult, because I want to say the word kind of artificial and surfacey, but it seems to be so derogatory sort of terms. But I don't mean it in a bad way. But there's something about Ravel that is just so pristine. The textures, the sounds, every note, and there's a kind of joy there as well, right? A little bit like Mozart in a way.
Well, exactly. It's almost like classical music with a 20th century French color. Ravel, it's wonderful, and that really appeals to me. So I hope to play that at some point.
I can imagine that coming out beautifully from your fingers. It's been really great to talk to you, Paul, and glad.
You too.
Glad to hear that concerts are happening again, and glad to hear that the live concerts are happening, and that you can really get back into the full swing of things, because I'm sure many people miss you. We certainly miss you at Hong Kong U, and we would love you to come back and get you to come and do that Schubert cycle, or We should do the Rachmaninoff and the Ravel. We'll see. But thank you so much for your time.
I miss you all too, and I hope to see you as soon as possible. It'd be such a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful that you're doing the Ravel and the Rachmaninoff and other stuff. It's cool.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's my advancing years, I sort of start to think of what I was doing 30 years before and think, I have sort of indulge myself in that again.
Most people start off, doing that stuff, and then in their old age they play this late Beethoven and late Schubert stuff. But you kind of did it the other way around. But anyway,
I'll do it the other way around. Exactly.